And we have more now on our top story, that racially motivated mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. 10 people were shot and killed yesterday. 3 more were wounded, all after a gunman dressed in tactical gear opened fire at a supermarket in a mostly black neighborhood. Some of the reaction we're seeing to the violence, U.S. President Joe Biden, he is calling it horrific, saying there is no harbor for domestic terrorism. The head of the NAACP calls the shooting absolutely devastating. And in this country, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canadians across the country are grieving with the people of Buffalo. For more from the scene, here's CNN's Gloria Pazmino in Buffalo.
What we know so far is that officials believe this was an act of hate. Peyton Gendron, driven by hate, by racism, which he wrote about extensively online. He targeted this area of Buffalo, the eastern part of the city, where there is a large African-American community. 10 people killed in that shooting yesterday afternoon when he arrived at this parking lot here behind me, opened fire, striking 4 people, 3 of them fatally. He then moved inside that supermarket where he was met by an armed security guard, a former police officer who was unable to stop him. He continued to shoot while inside the store, and then he exited the supermarket and surrendered to authorities. We also know, as you mentioned, that he was wearing tactical military-style gear, including a camera that was affixed to a helmet he was wearing. He live streamed the shooting live on the internet. Officials saying that they are investigating this as a hate crime. Brendan has been charged with a murder in the first degree. He pleaded not guilty shortly after he was indicted yesterday.
With a look from the scene, that was CNN's Gloria Pazmino. And now for his perspective, we've reached Uhuru Williams. He's a professor of history at the University of St. Thomas and a founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative, which focuses on supporting racial justice education. And we've reached him in St. Paul, Minnesota. Good morning, and thank you for being on the program today.
Good morning, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So I just wanted to start by getting your reaction to this shooting. What went through your mind when you first learned of it?
I was deeply saddened, but not surprised. I disagree with President Biden when he says there's no harbor for this, because clearly in North America, with the number of attacks that we've seen against communities of color, this has become a common occurrence, and certainly with the proliferation of guns here in the United States, this is a common occurrence. These are 2 issues that we need to work on as a broader society and culture to address, so we can end incidents like this. There's really no need for what we saw happen yesterday, and it's sad, and I was saddened by the fact that we have yet another incident like this that we have to mourn.
So many people are saddened by this, of course, in your country as well as here in Canada as well. And the mayor was saying that this is the worst nightmare that could happen for a community, saying that his community is hurting and seething. And he was quick to point out that this individual allegedly traveled from a community for several hours to get to this location. What did you think of that?
Clear indication that there was planning, that this individual targeted that community for very specific reasons. People are waking up and surprised and hurt and saddened by this. There's also this current concern about what do we do to deal with the proliferation of ideas like this, which are clearly damaging to communities, which clearly can lead to violence. But then also, and this is being very generous to the shooter, how do we stop this type of radicalization online in spaces where people have access to this type of irresponsible, hate-filled message that they then take to produce actions like this? As
the allegations are that he live streamed these incidents right on that social media platform, and also, of course, that this happened at a supermarket in the middle of the day. What do you think about the location and the timing of these alleged shootings?
Incredibly heinous, and again, unfortunately, something we've seen has become more common. We've seen terrorists, and I think it's appropriate to describe this individual as a terrorist, targeting people in spaces where they're incredibly vulnerable, at times when they're very vulnerable. This happened in New York City not too long ago in the subway during rush hour. We saw it in this particular case. We can talk about the incident in Texas a couple years back. And also global. We could talk about what happened in New Zealand. There's clearly this intent on the part of individuals who are driven by this type of anger to target people when they're vulnerable and where they're vulnerable. And this, to me, was particularly heinous given the time of day and the location, the supermarket.
Reigniting a conversation about hate crimes in your country and, as you mentioned, right around the world and here in Canada as well. And we also know that Reverend Al Sharpton has called on the White House to convene a meeting of Black and Jewish and Asian leaders to discuss combating hate crimes. What do you think of that move?
I think it's important, but I think we're in a stage now where we have to think beyond these types of conferences. I think it's an important first step, but the reality is, what concrete action can we take? The governor of New York this morning was very clear that she puts emphasis on what multimedia companies, what social media companies can do to help tamp down on this type of thing which proliferates online. There's also conversation about what we can do with regard to access to firearms and how we deal with that issue. So when we look at these two issues, certainly a conference and conversation about how to talk about these issues is important, but also we need action in those two critical areas.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on what is such a difficult day for so many. I appreciate all of your thoughts and comments this morning.
Thank you, Chris. Take care.
Yahuru Williams, a founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative in St. Paul, Minnesota.